Hi, so today I want to talk about Proclus and Uranus. This might seem surprising, since Uranus was recognized as a planet only in 1781, many centuries after Proclus died. So how can you have anything to say about Uranus? What connects them? Well, I'm more interested in what some contemporary astrologers have to say about Uranus and its significations, and um, taking what taking what they say on faith. So if things are as they describe it, then it seems that Proclus predicts that there should be such a heavenly body with these significations. Predicts is a poor word in this circumstance. It's more that he thinks that such a body exists necessarily in the heavens. So let me go by steps, right? So first of all, about Uranus. So I realized this when reading the astrologer Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche, where he says a number of things about Uranus, and one set of things, the first set of things, is that the significations attached to the planet fit poorly the myth of Uranus, of the father of Saturn and grandfather of Jupiter, but they fit very well the myth of Prometheus. So let me read a bit about that. So he writes, every major theme and quality that astrologers associate with the planet Uranus seem to be reflected in the myth of Prometheus with poetic exactitude. The initiation of radical change, the passion for freedom, the defiance of authority, the act of cosmic rebellion, the urge to transcend limitation, the creative impulse, the intellectual brilliance and genius, the element of excitement and risk. Okay, so that's one set of significations tied to Prometheus and to Uranus. And he also mentions that Uranus is connected by contemporary astrologers to knowledge of astrology itself. And also further on, there's a section of the book dedicated to studying Uranus transits that is conducted in the fashion of a rather old-fashioned history of ideas. But he basically seems to suggest that Uranus is connected to Prometheus also in the sense that its transits have an important sense in measuring out human history and revolutions in human history. And as you can see from what I read about the description of the myth of Prometheus as Tarnas has it, Uranus is practically embodies the values of an Enlightenment rebel. And so it's a very one-sided reading of the myth of Prometheus. We can't forget that Prometheus ultimately is set free by Hercules, and so he is reunited with Zeus ultimately. And there's and so the moment of his existence that we see depicted in Aeschylus, his rebellion and against Zeus. This is just one aspect of him that got exaggerated in the Romantic period. But so I'll get back to that. So that's Richard Tarnas on Uranus, and on Uranus as actually being Prometheus, right? The planet Uranus it has the significations of Prometheus. Now, if we go to Proclus's theory, go to Proclus Cosmology, we'll see that he says that Prometheus is indeed the god responsible for human beings. We will see that he is, and that there must be some planet associated with him. It's probably an invisible planet, and it's probably connected with Saturn, and so it's probably something at the very edge of the heavens, right? So being beyond Saturn, being slower than Saturn would be compatible with that. So let me go this by parts. So that Proclus thinks that every species has some heavenly body measuring out its life is something that I talked about in another video called Proclus on the Outer Planets. And also in another video where I read a passage of this from the from his commentary on the Republic. And in his commentary on the Republic, in that same text, he also talks about the fact that Prometheus is specifically the god responsible for the number of humanity. So this is drawn from Plato, from the Republic, the discussion of what's called the nuptial number, right? So Plato, in his account of why the ideal city would fall, he says that the guardians of the city would fail to calculate the exact number that they need to know in order to properly time the procreation of citizens. And because of that, their eugenics program would run into difficulties, citizens would not be born of the same quality, and therefore the city would degenerate. That is the view in the Republic. And it's the kind of thing that modern philosophers look at and think that it's a joke, and ancient philosophers read and said there must be some deep meaning behind this. And Proclus has many things to say about this passage. He has a whole essay about it in the commentary on the Republic. And during that, he discusses Prometheus. So in volume 2 of Kroll's edition, around page 20, he says that some Prometheus is responsible for the measure of humanity. This is not simply establishing the measure for the human lifespan, but also for the cycles of the human generations. Of course, those two things are linked, and also stages of life in a human's life and things like that. And there he says some Prometheus, probably indicating that the planet in question belongs to the Promethean chain. So the collection of entities that depend on Prometheus, the god, which as a qua-god is a henad. But later in page 53 of the same volume, he then discusses Prometheus himself. And then he says, in the same way that there are divine leaders for ascent and descent, we must understand that there is a single God that presides over both ascent and descent, and the double life in the world of generation, and sterility and fertility, which, if I must follow my own divination, my own manteia, should be considered none other than Prometheus. And then he goes on to quote the Protagoras myth and some Orphic texts to justify this identification. It's really interesting, this my own divination. It shows that this is something new from Proclus, that he's adding something, so it's probably something that wasn't even taught to him by his master Syrianus. So that's Proclus establishing that there's some planet that belongs to the god Prometheus, and it is the planet that measures out human lifespan and the cycles of human history, of the periods of fertility and infertility, the cycles that determine the fall of ideal cities, and presumably of non-ideal cities too. So it's the one that establishes these crucial numbers. And so what else can we know about this planet following Proclus' theory? So according to his theory about visible and invisible planets, the visible planets are leaders of invisible planets. Now, Uranus actually, in some times of the year, in some places, can actually be visible to the naked eye. It's just not very bright. It's rather pale, and so it's very difficult to see. Although there are people who argue that Hipparchus would have cited it in antiquity, but not recognized it as a planet. Herschel, in the 18th century, was the first one to do that. It moves very slowly. It spends 7 years in a sign. But so if Prometheus is a planet, right? If there is a planet associated with Prometheus, then it's not one of the 7 visible planets, it's going to follow another one. Which one? Well, Prometheus is really attached to Saturn, to Cronus, right? They are both Titans. They're both from the generation prior to Zeus. And furthermore, they both share the epithet ankylometes, right? So of a curved or bent wisdom or plan or counsel, right? And so they are both cunning, right? So Cronus is cunning in castrating his father, and then in maintaining his dominance by swallowing his children, and Prometheus is cunning in tricking Zeus about which part of the sacrifice he chooses. Furthermore, they are both connected to intellect, and that's how the Neoplatonists, that's how Proclus interprets this epithet of being turned in on oneself, of bent counsel. He doesn't understand it in the sense of cunning, in the sense of that they have twisted minds, but rather he interprets it in light of the fact that intellect by nature has itself as its object, right? So it's bent over in on itself, and so that's the feature he associates with Cronus as the god responsible for the essence of intellect. He is the first intellectual god. And it's what he associates also with Prometheus, who we saw is the god responsible for measuring out the ascent and descent of souls, and therefore also the lifetime of the animal that's adapted to souls, the human animal. But he also interprets the theft of the fire and the division of the sacrifice as Prometheus being responsible for the descent of the rational soul, right? So, and the rational soul is also bent back on itself. This is actually a really interesting fact that the philosophical use of the term reflection originally comes from a Neoplatonic commentary interpreting the demiurge's bending back of the soul on itself in the Timaeus. And so it interprets that as its, what we would call reflection on itself, on its self-knowledge, self-intention. And then that gets picked up later in Latin by Thomas Aquinas. And then that enters as reflectio, as the Latin term, in the Latin tradition, and then later gets picked up. But anyway, so they both share this epithet. They're both connected to intellect, also in Proclus, and it's very interesting. So how do we understand this following relationship, right? So the planet, the visible planet, has to be somehow a leader for the invisible planets. I suggested in my video on Proclus of the outer planets that it might be in some sense that the invisible planets share significations, overlap significations with the visible planet. And we see that in modern interpretations of Uranus, that they overlap or steal, like Prometheus steals fire, significations from Saturn. For instance, the association of Uranus with astrology overlaps with the traditional association of Saturn with astrology. There's Uranus is assigned, when it's assigned a certain sign to rule, it's assigned Aquarius, which is traditionally ruled by Saturn. And there are other things. So Saturn is also connected with discipline, and therefore study. Uranus can be seen connected with intellect and with cold, calculating intellect, Enlightenment, modern science type intellect. So there's some overlap of significations. So in a way, we can say that for Proclus, Proclus predicts that there should be such a planet in his astrological theory. But yeah, and this is just a little cool facet of Proclus's cosmology, and the basis of this cosmology will be the subject of my upcoming course, Time and the Gods. You can see an introduction to the course and also an overview of the syllabus below in the description of the video. Thanks.